screen and start going through the session with you, so hopefully you can all see that. So we're talking today about anti-racism for social sector line managers, and we're providing this session today, Roots HR, as part of our social impact. So we're a community interest company, we're a social enterprise ourselves, and so we reinvest profits and from monies that we have from our previous financial year, and also in year we sort of reinvest profits to be able to develop and deliver training and guidance and documentation for the social sector around people management. So this session today is provided free of charge through our HR Academy, which is all part of our social impact. And what we're going to be talking about today is, as we said, it's anti-racism for social sector line managers. So hopefully by the end of this session, you should have an understanding in regards to sort of a framework of equality, diversity, inclusion and equity, and why that's important in your workforce. A role that line managers can play in tackling racism within the workplace, some inclusive approaches to recruitment and selection, talking about the use of language within our teams and within our organisations, and within that then thinking about how to talk about race within the workplace. We're going to look at sort of microaggressions and really sort of what they are, how we can recognise them, and more importantly how we deal with them if they happen or come up within our sort of teams. And then we're going to make sure that we signpost you to support and resources and give you some ideas in terms of your sort of next steps. Now, obviously, I'm going to recognise the elephant in the room, that I'm sitting here as a white person talking about anti-racism for social sector line managers, and this is something that I'm very aware of and have always been very mindful of, particularly in talking about equality and diversity, as we've kind of sort of referred to things as. But it's an area that I'm always looking to address and increase my own personal knowledge and awareness of, because I think it's important for me, not just as a HR professional, but also as a manager, but also as an employee, but also as a person. I feel like I've got a sort of a moral, legal, ethical obligation to look and to educate myself on all of these matters. So yeah, so I'm fully aware that I'm sitting here with a sort of the white privilege that comes with my sort of race, talking about this issue, but hopefully through education and information that I've sought, that I can help others in this situation as well. But I don't ever claim to be or to have the lived experience that many people who are racially minoritized will have had. But I want to touch on and start talking about this sort of framework of equality, diversity, inclusion and equity as well, because equity might be a sort of a step on from what some people have heard being talked about previously. So most organisations, we will have been on a journey, and most organisations will have started off with policies, procedures and talking about things like equal opportunities. Then we started to talk about diversity, then we started to talk about inclusion, and now the conversation has sort of led on to this concept of equity as well. So I want to look at what each of those four mean, and then hopefully give a bit more of a sort of a visual demonstration of it. So equality is really about equal opportunities, equality of opportunity, ensuring that everyone has the same opportunity to fulfill their potential, free from discrimination. So we make sure that we've got a level playing field or platform for everybody. Diversity moved a step on from that, and it was about celebrating differences and recognising differences, looking at people more as sort of individuals and understanding the various perspectives that different individuals and backgrounds can bring to the table. And then inclusion moved beyond that and was focused on creating an environment where employees, if we think about it in a workplace, from all these various different backgrounds, can feel valued and can contribute fully. But equity is about thinking about it in, I guess, a more practical way, and thinking about how do we recognise and remove some of the barriers that some groups of employees face more than others, and what measures can we put in place to remove those barriers and to ensure equality of opportunity for everybody. So equity is about kind of not only recognising the differences, but then saying, okay, so what do we as an organisation, as an employer, as a manager have to do to recognise the barriers that some people face and put things in place to help give everybody that similar sort of opportunity. So this next slide, I think, hopefully is a good visual demonstration of that. If we think about equality of opportunity here in this slide, we're giving everybody the same bike to ride, but we can see that the impact is that not everybody is going to be able to ride that bike and enjoy that bike ride. Whereas equity is about, we've understood the differences between each of these four individuals, and we've removed the barriers by giving them access to a bike, in this case, that is going to meet their specific individual needs. So equity is that kind of the organisational part of it, if you like, the practical procedural things of what can we do to remove barriers and to ensure that everybody is able to sort of actively participate within the organisation, the team, whatever it is we're wanting them to participate in. So we want to look at why equality, diversity, and inclusion and equity are important for organisations. And so we've got a poll to go here. So I'm going to ask my colleague Leanne if she'll pop the poll up for us. And okay. I'm just going to ask you the question.
Okay, the poll's live.
Okay, so the poll is, why are equality, diversity, inclusion and equity important? And there's a number of boxes, and you can select all of those that apply. So we've got legal obligations, social justice, employee attraction and retention, market competitiveness, reputation, values, or all of the above. So you can select as many of those as you think apply, and then just hit the submit button. And we'll see what we get in terms of responses. Just give everybody the opportunity to complete that poll. Okay. If anybody's having trouble accessing the poll, normally it should pop up on the screen, or sometimes it appears in the chat function. So do have a look in the chat function. But we've had sort of 36 responses now. So we're seeing quite a sort of a divisive sort of split, or quite a split amongst responses there. And we can see that we've got around sort of 19–20% suggesting that all of the above are important. 11% legal obligations, 14% social justice, 14% employee attraction and retention, 9% market competitiveness, 12% reputation, 16% values, and 21% now for all of the above. You're probably all right, because we think that actually it's probably all of those which are reasons why it's diversity, inclusion, equity are important to organisations. Legal obligations, there is a legal requirement. Obviously, we'll touch on the legal framework next, but there are legal obligations on organisations as employers, and potentially, if you provide services as the provider of services, to adhere to certain legislation. And we'll touch on the Equality Act in a second. But social justice, there's a social justice argument that's based on the belief that everyone should have a right to equal access to employment, and when employed should have equal pay, equal access to training and development, as well as obviously a workplace that's free from any sort of discrimination, which can include sort of harassment and bullying. That's typically, you know, a sort of a right to be treated fairly. So we've got legal obligations, there's a sort of a social justice reason, and there's also a sort of a business case. If we think about, as an employer, there are business case arguments which sort of build on not only the legal obligations and the social justice arguments, but you know, if we think about ourselves as individuals and as employees of organisations, you will probably know that you will want to work for an employer who has good employment practices. You will also want to feel valued at work. So there is a sort of a people obligation in terms of equality, diversity, inclusion and equity to be able to attract and retain employees. You know, we, as I said, we want to work for employers who've got good employment practices. So it's important that from that point of view of attracting and retaining our employees, that we think about the importance of equality, diversity, inclusion and sort of equity. But also from a market competitiveness point of view, a diverse workforce can help us in terms of thinking about new markets, new products, new services, can open up or broaden our existing sort of client base. So, you know, examples of that can include local authorities who might be looking to improve the way they provide services to diverse groups within the sort of the local community. So from a business case, we've got to think about attracting and retaining employees, because as employees, we typically want to work for an organisation that has good employment practices, values us as individuals. Also, there's benefits in terms of potential market competitiveness, but also there's a reputation as well. You know, if we're looking at ourselves as an organisation, again, this could be to help in terms of attracting employees, but it could be in terms of the reputation within the sector, perhaps reputation with other stakeholders, partner organisations, commissioners, then actually a sort of a healthy business that has good equality, diversity, inclusion and equity principles is probably likely to be viewed very positively, both within the local community and with other stakeholders as well. So it can help in terms of sort of, you know, reputation of the organisation to both potential service users, potential partners, potential employees. And obviously there's also a values part. It's, you know, it can be part of the values of the organisation as to why we want to make sure that we are inclusive and that we are, you know, looking at our practices to see what we need to do to make sure that we're supporting a very diverse background of employees that hopefully we have in our organisations. So there are legal, social and business cases as well as just really a sort of an ethical or a moral obligation as to why equality, diversity, inclusion and equity are important. And the legal framework itself is covered by the Equality Act 2010, which hopefully most of you will be aware of. And as I said earlier, this act, it's applicable to organisations as employers in regards to our employees. It's also applicable to people who have applied to our organisation. So those candidates who perhaps apply for jobs within our organisation are also protected by this legal framework of the Equality Act. So they have a right not to be discriminated against. And also, if we're a provider of services, then service users also have protection under the Equality Act as well. And the Equality Act identifies 9 what are referred to as protected characteristics, one of which is race or ethnicity. And it is unlawful to discriminate against individuals on the basis of these protected characteristics. There are some examples where some discrimination could be lawful. One of those is something where particularly a direct discrimination can occur that would otherwise be unlawful, is what's known as a genuine occupational requirement. So if there were a requirement, particularly let's think of personal services. So if you had somebody who was working perhaps in a social care setting, dealing with very personal care for an individual, it may be that there's a genuine occupational requirement there for there to be either a female or a male employee working with that particular individual, and that would be referred to as a genuine occupational requirement. So there are some aspects within the law where some discriminatory treatment is lawful, but on the whole it's unlawful to discriminate against on the grounds of any of these 9 protected characteristics, and discrimination is typically through direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, discrimination by association, by perception, and harassment and victimisation. I'm not going to go into the sort of the definitions of those, but obviously I can signpost those to you where you can find out some more information on those particular definitions of what discrimination looks like. So that's sort of the framework. So we think about there being this legal obligation, the sort of the moral, ethical obligations, and then also the business case for equality, diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I'm going to move on to look at some of the sort of more practical aspects of how we can look to become more anti-racist within our organisation. So particularly focusing on racially sort of minoritized groups, and how we can think about some of our practical and procedural sort of people processes that you'll likely get involved in as managers. So I'm going to start by looking at sort of the role of managers and concentrating on what do we really mean by sort of being anti-racist, and then we'll look at some of the sort of the practical aspects of it. So since the sort of Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly from sort of summer of 2020, I think it was now, with the sort of the murder of George Floyd, many organisations have sort of moved beyond even equality, diversity, inclusion and equity, and have sought to take a stance that they are seeking to become, or that they are actively sort of anti-racist. And the CIPD, which is the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, have put together some guidance on this, and I'm going to signpost you to some of the line manager guidance as well later on in the session, and you will get a copy of the slides. We'll send out a copy of the slides after this session, because as I say, particularly towards the end, there are some slides where they've got links, some signposting to other resources for you. But the CIPD said, you know, organisations are a part of society, and so they must be a part of the solution to ending racism, not a part of the problem, and that stamping out racism in all forms, whether covert or overt, should be at the heart of responsible business. So there has been a clear sort of movement, and as I say, direction, particularly since sort of summer of 2020, for organisations wanting to take a stance or seeking to become sort of anti-racist. And we can see this in some of the organisations within our own sector. They've just included a copy of a sort of a screenshot from Rethink Mental Illness charity, and their stance on their website, and they talk about becoming an anti-racist organisation. And they said that their values, so their organisational values of hope, understanding, expertise, commitment, passion, and openness underpin everything that they seek to achieve. And following the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, they made a firm commitment to become a truly anti-racist organisation. So many organisations, and particularly within our sort of social sector, are seeking to take this stance of being anti-racist. So what is the role of a line manager in this, in terms of supporting an organisation to become anti-racist? I think as a sort of a line manager working within an organisation, your role really is integral to tackling racism within the workplace. And there are areas where you can make sort of significant impact. The first one is around, just role modelling and leading on inclusion or promoting inclusion policies that you might have within your organisation. So ensuring that you're aware of the sort of stance and the policies that your organisation has, and that you're really role modelling those with your team, so it kind of becomes second nature to you and your team around that. Your sort of approach to recruitment and career progression. So, selection could be for recruitment of new roles. It could be where we're looking to progress or promote people throughout the organisation. So your approach to that sort of recruitment and selection, such as who and how you recruit, job adverts, questions that are asked in appraisals, how you might decide who has talent and potential within the organisation, to think of things like succession planning or promotions. Key role, I think, in understanding how advantage and disadvantage can play out in the workplace, even in very small ways, so thinking about things like how you socialise with work colleagues, who might get opportunities for particular projects or assignments or secondments, relationships that you build, your own sort of network within the organisation, and thinking about that kind of understanding, I guess, your role and relationships and networks that you have within the organisation. And I think that being able to create trust for your team, and being consistent in your focus on being inclusive. So being able to potentially challenge behaviours that don't support an anti-racist workplace, and being an ally, if that's the case, dependent upon your own sort of background, but being an ally to staff who perhaps come from minority backgrounds. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of language and challenging behaviours in a short while. And I think creating a culture free from microaggressions. We're going to talk about microaggressions as well shortly, what they are and your role, and how you can notice when microaggressions take place and actually address those. Again, that could all feel quite difficult to sort of challenge or address things such as sort of microaggressions, use of language, etc. But we will touch on those as we go through. And again, I'll sort of signpost you to various support that's out there and available for you. So I think there's a key role that you as a line manager can take in taking an anti-racist stance and supporting your organisation in terms of its work to becoming, or if it is in fact an anti-racist organisation already, to remain that way. So I'm going to touch on a few of these things now, particularly around sort of inclusive recruitment and selection, looking at things such as the use of language, talking about race, and understanding and dealing with things such as sort of microaggressions. So recruitment and selection, and in particular thinking about inclusive recruitment and selection, as we need to be mindful of, pre-employment job applicants, as we've said, are covered by the Equality Act. So it is unlawful to discriminate against individuals in the way that the job's offered. So the way it's advertised, your sort of interview techniques, the terms that you offer. So thinking about pay, levels of pay, benefits, or by simply refusing or not recruiting somebody because they have a particular protected characteristic. So as we said, there is a legal obligation there. And employers will typically mitigate risks of claims of discrimination within their recruitment and selection by using a sort of a well-documented merit-based recruitment and selection process. And just to sort of give a high-level view of what that would typically look like, and again, in the signposting at the end of the session, I'm going to signpost you to a couple of free HR toolkits that we offer as an organisation that are specific to recruitment and selection, that will help. They give you information, they give you guidance, template documents, so they can help you as a manager, your organisation, to sort of have this systematic, merit-based approach to recruitment and selection that just help mitigate some of the sort of risks that there might be around discriminating people with any protected characteristic through your recruitment and selection activities. So I'll signpost you to that towards the end of the session. But thinking about and sort of breaking recruitment and selection down into three high levels, so advertising, shortlisting and selection, there are some key things that you can do in terms of your practices and thinking about equity of your recruitment practices. I think it's really important in terms of advertising, but this will come into your job description, your person spec, your advert, and also thinking about your website, particularly if you have a careers page, to make sure that you're using inclusive language, and to make sure that you're not using language that would particularly exclude individuals. And there are some tools that are available on the internet now that will actually analyse things such as a job advert and will tell you whether language is specifically, the way that it's written is perhaps specifically not targeting, but is perhaps without the intent, is not attractive, or may help to exclude certain minoritized groups. So that may be racially, it may be accessibility. If we think of potential disabled candidates, it may be gender. So it's where the language is potentially coded so it resonates more with a particular group that tends to be perhaps the white male group. So there are tools that are available that can help you look at the language that's used in things like your job adverts to ensure that it's open and is not unintentionally meaning that people from certain minoritized groups may not be welcome or open to receiving your job advertisement. Also look at the requirements of the person specification and make sure that they really are appropriate to the job role. We still work with clients, today to look and review their person spec where there are criteria that have been set in there that are not relevant for the role and could actually be indirectly discriminating against particular protected characteristics, be that age, sex, race, etc. So make sure that any of the criteria, so things like education, qualifications, experience, knowledge, are really relevant and appropriate to the job role, so that again you're not potentially excluding a particular group of individuals from applying for the role. And also think about the accessibility of the adverts. Where are you placing the job adverts? Are they accessible in terms of readable? There are again some job sites that are out there where, again, if you're looking to target, if you've identified that you want to target applicants from a particular perhaps racially minoritized group, there are specific job boards that are out there that you can use that again sort of will target that group for you. So again, think about where you're placing your job adverts, and if there are job boards available that could potentially help you to get to a underrepresented group that perhaps you've struggled to attract to the organisation before. But also have a look, again, particularly think about your website and the imagery. You know, candidates, they might look at your website and they'll look for signs of diversity as a sort of a promise of inclusion, if you like. So, you know, they will look to see. So it's a good opportunity to reflect and have a look on what diversity would candidates see if they took a look at your website now. When it comes to having received applications, then first step in the selection process is typically shortlisting of those applications. We'd recommend anonymising applications where that's possible, because anonymisation can help perhaps mitigate any potential biases, and we're going to talk a little bit about unconscious bias coming up, but can help mitigate bias, as can having more than one person shortlisting. And in terms of shortlisting, we would normally recommend that you just use a simple scoring system to score the applicants against the person's specification for the role. And again, the toolkit that we'll signpost you to has actually got a shortlisting template document in there that you can use. And when it comes to selection, and particularly sort of thinking about interviews, then obviously we recommend that you use structured interviews, so that you've developed the questions for the interview panel in advance of the interviews. Candidates are being asked the same questions. And we'd recommend that you have a panel, so more than one person interviewing. Again, that can help just mitigate any potential unconscious bias that there might be. And it's really helpful if people who are on the panel have been through some training in regards to inclusive recruitment and selection. Again, we recommend a simple scoring system that's focused on the person's spec and the answers to the questions. And if you are looking at any selection tests, so in addition to interviews, to make sure that those that are picked are really sort of relevant for the job role. But as I say, we do have and will signpost you to the toolkit that I think will just help you kind of put in place that sort of inclusive approach to recruitment and selection moving forward. We talked about the sort of the use of language, and we said how, again, for line managers, it's really important to sort of role model things within your team. I think role modeling of inclusive language, role modeling of inclusive language is really important, and it's for us to think about the language that we're using. And inclusive language is typically trying to avoid sort of biases, slangs, or expressions that might discriminate, but also avoiding using sort of umbrella terms. For years, the sort of term BAME was used, you know, to Black and minority ethnic groups, and people have moved away from using that terminology now and tend to use terms such as sort of racially minoritized, which tends to feel slightly less reductive and also acknowledges that is not just one particular singular homogenous group, you know, that actually it acknowledges a lot more differences in backgrounds than terminology such as BAME. So I think it's really important to understand the use of language and terminology within this area is one that does sort of move quite regularly. You know, there's learning and progression. So I think it's something that we all have an obligation to keep up to date with and an understanding on. I think it's also important to really be aware and have an understanding of intersectionality. So there are people from sort of protected or minoritized groups who are going to experience, you know, potentially oppression or discrimination or unfair treatment in various ways. For example, if you had a female Black employee within your team, then there's an intersectionality there in terms of gender and race, and there may be other intersectionalities there, but there is the risk that that individual could potentially be discriminated against or receive unfair treatment based on more than one protected characteristic, you know, and so it's being aware of that, you know, the lived experience of somebody who, as I say, is perhaps that female, black, perhaps working class employee, is potentially going to be very different from the white male middle class employee. So it's being aware that actually there are people, individuals who have that sort of intersectionality of more than one protected group or more than one sort of background or characteristic that could be in the minority, where they may feel that they're receiving unfair sort of treatment. So I think it's really important to have an understanding of intersectionality as well. And also to be aware of unconscious bias. We touched on this briefly, talking about recruitment and selection, but unconscious bias is really a sort of a theory about shortcuts. And it's that our unconscious thoughts and our brain works much quicker than our conscious ones. And it's like a mental shortcut. It can be useful in certain circumstances, but it can lead us to make decisions based on prior experience, you know, but that can include forms of prejudice and potential discrimination, and it can impact on our sort of decision making in the workplace as well. You know, we all have biases, you know. A form of unconscious bias is sort of almost like a sort of a halo effect, where we perhaps have seen good characteristics, you know, performance behaviours, etc., in an individual previously. So we kind of imprint those that sort of halo effect on those characteristics for any further individual that we meet. So we kind of put a halo effect on that person because they remind us of this previous person over here that we had a good experience with. So it is that sort of shortcut that will make a decision on person B here based on our experience of person A, when they are in fact two completely different people. And obviously when you're in a situation such as selection interviews, you know, you're making a lot of quick first impression decisions about somebody in a very short space of time. So we quite often use those sort of mental shortcuts to help us in that decision making. And that's where we can be bringing in our previous stereotypes, our unconscious bias into that decision making. We all have these biases. I think the key thing is to be really aware of them and seek to mitigate them. And I think being aware of unconscious bias is really through our own sort of educating ourselves, you know, and I think really seeking to sort of unlearn previous beliefs and perhaps replace them with new ones. And I think discussion and education is really important for us all. I think about having conversations with colleagues about inclusive language, about unconscious bias, about race. And we're going to touch on that, talking about race in a second. But I think we do have to be very mindful that we shouldn't expect people from minoritized groups, so racially minoritized individuals, to have to educate or teach us about anything. We may seek to understand if they're willing to share experiences to give us greater understanding, but actually we shouldn't expect people to have to do that. It is not their role. We need to educate ourselves as well. So I think we need to be very mindful of that when we are talking and having conversations about race. So on that note, I'm going to ask Leanne just to open up another poll, and it's just to ask which of these conversations would you be confident to discuss in the workplace? So if you want to just answer the poll. So again, you can select any of the following that apply. So we've got age, disability, gender identity, race, religion and belief, sexual orientation, pregnancy and maternity, all of the above or none of the above. So you can select any of those that apply to you and sort of submit your answers. we'll give you a short while just to sort of submit your answers, and then we'll take a look and see what people are saying in terms of what they feel, which of those conversations you feel you would be confident to discuss in the workplace. So I'm just going to give you some time just to answer that, because I know it takes a little bit of thought to think through these areas. Okay. Okay. So we've got sort of 55% of people saying that they'd be comfortable talking about all of the above, which is fantastic. Then if we've got sort of 12% of respondents at the moment saying none of the above. Sorry, that's changed slightly now. So we've got 54% saying all of the above, 14% saying none of the above, and then some people who would be comfortable discussing sort of disability, pregnancy and maternity. So thank you for that. That's not unusual. It's quite a high level of people saying that you would feel comfortable discussing all of the above, which is fantastic. And I fully appreciate that pregnancy, maternity and disability may be things that people are discussing more frequently than perhaps others within the workplace setting, because of having to look at things like reasonable adjustments or dealing with sort of maternity leave and pregnancy risk assessments and all of those. But it's actually a good response that sort of over 50% of you would feel comfortable talking about all of the above. I think talking about, any protected characteristic, but I think particularly thinking about race or ethnicity, I think learning about ourselves and others can make these types of conversations easier. So I certainly think sessions, hopefully such as today, and some of the signposting that I can do for you will hopefully make some of the conversations slightly easier. But in terms of sort of talking about race at work, again, there was a report by the CIPD that came up in terms of talking about race at work. And of the employees who were sort of surveyed as part of this report, 40% of those who fit within the racially minoritized group, so 40% of racially minoritized employees wanted to talk about race at work, but only 20% of managers actually initiated conversations about race or ethnicity. And 67% of the managers who were surveyed didn't feel comfortable talking about race and ethnicity. So we've sort of got a real gap there between people wanting to talk about, and particularly those from racially minoritized groups wanting to talk about race and perhaps talk about their experiences, with only a limited number of managers actually initiating those conversations, and a much larger group of managers not feeling comfortable talking about race and ethnicity. So I think your sort of ability as a line manager to help your teams openly discuss issues of race or racism or other forms of perhaps unfair treatment, I think can really help your team's ability to work towards developing really healthy relationships and creating sort of full participation and collaboration. So I think it's really important to sort of help people move from perhaps competitive or defensive or neutral behaviour through to sort of full collaboration with others within their sort of teams. So I think there is an acceptance that this might be new for people, it might be uncomfortable for people. But I think the intention should always be to look to share lived experiences, or to give space to individuals to share lived experiences if that's something that they want to do, and to allow then for learning for others as well. So, you know, there are some sort of questions that can potentially start conversations. You know, how has your racial identity affected your experience as an employee here? You know, potentially as a line manager from a different ethnic group, how could I better manage you? You know, how do you feel as an organisation we respond or deal with increased awareness of issues of racial discrimination? So I think there are questions that can sort of open up the conversation, but I think it's really important that we remember that actually, you know, these conversations and the sort of the shared experiences is be really mindful that, you know, again, don't expect racially minoritized individuals to have to educate you or teach you. But if this is about creating a space for people who want to express or talk about their lived experience to share that information, but don't have an expectation that people are going to educate you. So I think it's about creating that space and give that opportunity for people if they want to share. And I think it can also allow perhaps amongst the team or the group clarity as to what inclusive language is, what that looks like, and almost sort of create some agreements within that group as to what inclusive language is and what should be used. And I think that can just help in terms of really enhancing relationships and people working together. But as I say, I think it's about, as a manager, being able to create space for these conversations, but not necessarily having an expectation that individuals are going to educate or teach you. And I think one of the things that we have to be mindful of and have awareness of as well as managers is in regard to sort of microaggressions. So again, we've just got a poll that we're going to put up that I'm going to get Leanne to just run now. Just a very brief simple poll, which is just to get an understanding as to whether people feel that they understand or they know what microaggressions are. So it's just, do you know what's meant by microaggression? Just yes, no, or unsure. So if I can ask you just to submit your answers to those, and then we'll go through and just talk about sort of microaggressions, and again thinking about this and how to deal with this within your team. Okay, so we've got at the moment 62% saying yes, they understand what microaggression is, 8% don't understand, and 31% are unsure, which is, yeah, but that's probably what I was expecting, that, you know, we'd probably have a sort of a 2/3 1/3 split. So thank you for answering that. So microaggressions are typically what we think of as probably a subtle comment or behaviour that can indicate to someone that the person speaking perhaps thinks they don't belong. So a classic example would be asking somebody who is from a racially minoritized group and who's lived here in the UK all of their life, you know, where are you from? You know, yeah, I'm from London. And then the next response is, no, where are you really from? You know, that follow-up comment of the no, where are you really from is an example of a sort of a verbal microaggression, you know, that assumption that the individual doesn't belong because they look different, they are from a racially minoritized group, so they're not really from here, although they may have been born in the UK, they are from somewhere else. So that's an example of a sort of a verbal microaggression. A behavioural microaggression is similar. Again, it's sort of insensitive or potentially problematic action, typically related to some form of stereotype. So, you know, again, it could be even something like assuming an older member of the team is not very IT literate, can't use technology. You know, that's a kind of behavioural microaggression. And so your role as a manager is really to sort of notice when microaggressions take place and seek to address them. You know, the first step, I guess, is take all the steps to try and create a culture where microaggressions are understood, so that they're prevented. You know, prevention is better than cure, but that they could be addressed if they do take place. So I think it is important to understand what microaggressions are so that you can notice them when they happen. And obviously, if somebody comes to you to talk about a microaggression, is to be able to sort of take some action on those. But what does that look like in terms of those actions, and what happens if we commit the microaggression ourselves, even if we didn't realise it at the time? I think if we've committed a microaggression, or somebody has brought something to our attention that we've done or said that they viewed as a microaggression, I think it's really important to resist the urge to act defensively. And listen to what the person's saying, and really try and avoid that initial defensive response, which might be, I didn't mean it, or it could be, if we were trying to make a joke, it was just a joke, I didn't mean it. Because it's not about the intent. It's not about the intent that you have. You may not have intended to do that. It's about the impact that it has had on the other individual. So it's really important to try and resist that urge to respond defensively, and to try and you know, almost you know, give the sort of the reason, you know, I didn't mean it, I was just trying to make a joke. But I think it's listen to what the people says and acknowledge the impact of what's happened. So that's really important, regardless of your intent, I think, is to acknowledge the impact that it's had, and sort of acknowledge that this can be a really helpful sort of learning experience for you. And I think, you know, I would always encourage you to apologise, and say, again, regardless of your intent, to apologise for the individual. But obviously you may not get immediate sort of forgiveness, but I think it allows for that opportunity to potentially ask questions, but as I say, to sort of to educate yourself as well. I think the real important thing there is not to say, you know, not to listen to the individual, to not get defensive, and to not to actually, you know, try and you know, rationalize what you were doing, what you were saying. It's to hear the impact that it's had on the individual, and to use that in a really positive way to sort of to learn from that. And as a manager, what if you witness a sort of a microaggression occurring? Again, the key thing is noticing it, realizing something's happened that is a microaggression. And I think then it's about understanding the sort of priority order of what needs to happen. Are you in a situation, you know, check the environment, are there other people around? Is it a priority to, you know, remove the individual to whom the microaggression was aimed at from that situation? You know, is there an innocuous way that you can do that initially? You know, to sort of take them away, have a, you know, ask them to join you for another a separate conversation, something of that nature. Do you need to you know, remove that person? Can that person be removed quite innocuously from that situation so that you can talk to them and seek to get their sort of feedback and input? But I think you've also got to think, is it appropriate to address it at that point? So who else is there? You know, if you're in the middle of showing a commissioner from the local authority around, then you know, and something happens, it may not be appropriate to address the situation or recognise it right there and then. You might need to deal with it at the next most appropriate time, you know, once the commissioner has exited the area. And then I think it's in terms of being able to listen to the individual who was potentially at the end of that sort of microaggression, and to be able to address that, and particularly feed that back to the individual who was potentially the microaggressor. And I've got a little sort of feedback tool that I can go through with you shortly, and it's really again about for that individual using this situation as a sort of an opportunity for learning and an opportunity to understand the impact of that was a microaggression, the impact of that microaggression, and what can be done differently moving forward. So I'll go through that feedback loop in terms of the next slide. But I think it's also important, just while we're talking about microaggressions, to also be aware of other sort of triggers and things that people might say, you know, and things such as, oh, it's International Women's Day, why don't we have an International Men's Day? I mean, yes, International Men's Day is actually the 19th of November. You know, Black History Month, why don't we have a White History Month? So I think it's being able to also be aware of what may be viewed as triggers for some people, and again, perhaps being able to have the conversations with those individuals to feedback to them and understanding the sort of the impact of what it is that they're raising. So a good sort of feedback model that can be helpful in these situations is, I don't know whether you've come across this before, but is the EEC model. And this is it's a sort of simple, structured way to give feedback. It consists of 3 steps: example, effect, and change. And in the example step, you describe the specific situation or the behaviour that you observed. So again, that could be the actual microaggression. In the effect step, you explain how the situation or behaviour affected, if it was towards you, or obviously if it was towards another individual or the team as a whole, how it has affected those individuals. And that's where you can talk about impact. And in the change step, that's where you have the sort of the discussions that allow you to sort of almost agree a different action or outcome for the future. So a different approach that somebody may take in the future. And this sort of EEC model, I think, just helps in the fact that it can help to focus on facts, feelings and solutions, rather than sort of blaming anybody, you know, judgments or blames. It's a lot more sort of focused on this was what happened, this was the impact, and seeking to look at solutions or change moving forward. So I just think for situations such as this EEC model is quite a good model to potentially use and think about in terms of framing feedback to somebody, particularly if it's a sort of a microaggression where they may not have been, their intent may not have been to hurt somebody, but the impact has been that it has caused that sort of hurt. So that effect section allows you to articulate that impact, I think, quite clearly. So I think that can be a really good model in terms of looking at feeding back on sort of microaggressions. So just to sort of to wrap up, in terms of next steps, I think, again, it's really important to listen to the staff, never sort of dismiss lived experiences, you know, or make issues, their issues about you. Reflect on, you know, any past or present biases that might have impacted on the sort of the careers of the team. You know, seek feedback from the team, seek to sort of create a culture where it becomes more familiar to have conversations about race or perhaps other protected characteristics. Where possible, you know, look to educate yourself. I think don't rely on others to give you all the answers. You know, it can take a considerable toll for individuals to have to relive experiences of racism and bias, and to then expect people to, you know, following on from that, to take time to educate you it can be particularly difficult. So I think it's really helpful to look to have their shared lived experience, you know, their lived experience shared so others can appreciate it, but to still take the responsibility for education initially. And I think obviously, you know, call out behaviour that doesn't advance the sort of commitment to sort of tackling racism and learn and help individuals learn how to sort of do better. So as I said, I'm going to share the slides because I've got some signposting you to some support on these slides here. So there's a CIPD guide on how to talk about race at work, some bite-sized videos, the Roots toolkits that I talked about, also some guidance from ACAS. There's also, from an education point of view, a really great LinkedIn conversation, a video that you can watch from John Amici, and also books by Emma Dabiri, and also books So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijomu Olulu. So yeah, just have a look through those. They are both very good books if you're interested in just some more sort of personal education. So I'm conscious of time. We've gone a little bit over on time, but are there any sort of questions that anybody has at this stage that want to run through? You can see there's been some conversation in the chat. Let me just have a look to see. Okay. Learning to say good, genuine apology can be useful. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Nikki. I'm sorry for what I did rather than I'm sorry you felt like that. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I don't think we've got any questions then, so I will just finish off by saying thank you very much for coming along today. You can connect with us in different ways that are on the slide there. We will share the slides with you after the session today, so thanks very much for attending, and I hope that's been helpful. Thank you all. Bye.